Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is a series of videos where I talk about what I'm reading and what I've recently read. There's two books that I finished since the last episode or edition of Fresh Red Kills that I filmed. The first one that I finished was Between Two Fires, an epic tale of medieval horror by Christopher Buehlman. And I did this as a buddy read with Steve over at Steve Talks About Books and Stuff. A very prolific, very good booktube channel that I certainly recommend that people check out. I think ultimately I might have actually enjoyed this one a little bit better. I'm sorry, a little bit more than Steve did, based on the video that he had made about it a while back. This is a story which takes place in 14th century France as the Black Death is moving through, especially in northern France. It's just a few years after Cressy. One of our main characters is a knight named Thomas, or a former knight. He's basically lost his knighthood, he's lost his lands, he's lost his wife, and he has been living as a brigand with a group of other guys for a while as the plague is basically, killing off most of the population. And he meets a mysterious young girl whose family is dead. She's an orphan, but she seems to have certain abilities, maybe even a touch of the divine within her. And they also team up with a priest who is gay and was struggling with his own matters of faith and his own piety. And they kind of make this kind of unlikely trio as they trek on a mission, maybe a divine mission, trying to bring this little girl to the Pope. Again, moving through these plague lands, and lands that aren't just being attacked by the plague, they seem to be attacked by a demonic presence. We have in times of the living dead, statues coming to life and profaning sacred images. We have almost mutations within rivers. So it's this kind of weird semi-fantasy landscape that they are going through. That's one of the things I like about this. Buehlman takes inspiration for a lot of the horrors, from the experiences of 14th century French people. These individuals that we follow along, they do not feel like 21st century transplants who have just been stuck in the 14th century with all of our, progressive attitudes. They are people of their time. And I think that he does a great balancing act, because it can be hard to like people of the 14th century because of their attitudes, because of their beliefs, because of what they do. So I think he strikes a pretty good compromise. He allows them to grow. He allows them to, act and think and feel in a certain way, which makes them endearing to us, but doesn't throw us off. It doesn't feel too anachronistic when that happens. He does a very good job of writing action. As much as I love action, and if anybody watches my channel, they also know that I'm a big lover of historical edged weapons. Despite that, I think a lot of authors can write their action kind of dull. I sometimes find myself skimming over those sections because it doesn't really move the plot along, or it doesn't feel like it has the edge of your seat anticipation that it should. But he does a good job with that. I really like the action scenes in here, and he seems to really actually understand the weapons that he's talking about as well. It does start getting kind of trippy as it goes, not in a bad way, but the whole last act of this kind of goes a little bit bonkers. And I would say that there is something of a Deus Ex Machina that happens in here as the way that things are resolved. But whereas that would normally be a criticism in the context of this story, which is essentially about a divine goodness battling an evil, right? And not like a philosophical evil. We're talking about like literal evil from hell. That Deus Ex Machina quality kind of makes sense within the context of all this. Now, I will say that even though this does deal with certainly, Christianity, the way that he approaches goodness, I actually really appreciated. It wasn't about faith. It wasn't about what these characters believed. It really was about forgiveness. It was about being able to forgive not only others but also yourself. There's a lot of self-loathing in at least two of our male characters, and they have to learn to forgive themselves and then also to forgive others. To learn the difference between forgiveness and justice, and follow a path of forgiveness rather than seeking justice on people. And a lot of it is about just finding goodness in a horrible world. And I thought that stuff was actually very good. So yeah, I actually really enjoyed this, and I would recommend it if this sounds like something you'd be interested in. Medieval horror. I would highly recommend it. In the back, he does kind of credit a book which has been on my radar for a while, so I think I'm going to want to pick it up. And it's A Distant Mirror, right, by Barbara Tuchman. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but I remember seeing that around, and that's definitely what I'm going to have to pick up. I know that he relied quite heavily on that when he was reading this. So anyway, yeah, one that I really enjoyed, Between Two Fires. Another one that I finished that was also kind of a booktube inspired read. This is Juan over at Plagued by Visions. He kind of has he doesn't call it a book club, but it's basically something like a book club. This was one of the selections, and he did a live stream discussion of this that I thought was quite interesting. And this is Ray Russell, The Case Against Satan. This was published in 1962, and it's about the possession of a young girl. Young, I mean, she's a teenager. She's around 16 years old. And a priest, Catholic priest, and a bishop who are trying to exorcise the demon from her. I don't think it takes too much of a stretch to realize that this was probably, an influence on The Exorcist. It does come almost a decade before The Exorcist. But it is still its own animal. You can see it's a thin little thing. It didn't take long to read. But I'm a big fan of The Exorcist. I mean, the book I like. I think the book is great. But the film, especially, William Friedkin's adaptation based on the script by William Peter Blatty, that's one of my favorite horror films of all time. I just think it is a beautiful film. And despite that, I am not a huge fan of possession slash, I would say especially exorcism subgenres of horror. I tend to find them a little bit hokey. Their worldview maybe a little bit too old-fashioned in this kind of good and evil dichotomy. And characters generally I don't think are very well drawn. One of the most famous exorcism movies that is pretty well loved in the horror community, although I'm not really one of them, and that is The Exorcism of Emily Rose. People tend to love that film. I don't. I actually find it kind of manipulative and based on a true event that I think was essentially the slow torture of somebody who was mentally disturbed. That's kind of made out to be something inspiring. I don't want to get too much into that with this video. I do belong to, or I co-host a horror movie discussion podcast called the HORRORCAST, and we had a big long discussion when we talked about that episode, which in an episode that we also talked about the Exorcist. But one of the things about that movie is that people often talk about it as though it like presents, well, you can believe the exorcism or you don't have to. It gives you a rational explanation for everything too. But that's not really what the movie does. The movie front loads, it weighs everything in terms of the supernatural. We have this atheistic lawyer who is, basically getting close to seeing like divine inspiration. We actually see a priest like being stalked by, which I guess is like the devil. I know he's wearing like a cloak, like he just walked off of a Hammer horror film. I don't know. You can tell I'm not a big fan of that. I wish that it was a movie that gave us two sides equally of maybe she was possessed and maybe she wasn't. And this is in a similar vein, this story. Whereas, okay, if we go back to The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty was a true believer in demonic possession and an exorcism. And he wrote what I think is actually a very compelling novel of The Exorcist with characters that feel incredibly real. Okay. Yes, there's exorcism in there, but it's not entirely about that. There's a certain human drama, and Father Karras, especially, I think, is a terrific character. In this, we have Ray Russell giving us situations where we can maybe interpret what's going on not as demonic possession, but he kind of gives us these. They sound like very convoluted psychological explanations. They're so convoluted at times that you can't help but think, at this point, demonic possession sounds like the more rational choice. Um, he's kind of going for that, right? So he doesn't come, it seems like, as a true believer like Blatty did to the demonic possession story. And I don't think that he succeeds in giving us characters that feel very real. I think the characters are mostly pretty flat in one note. Um, you get a couple little quirks here and there, but they never came off the page as something real to me. And just like the exorcism of Emily Rose, I don't think that we can walk away from this thinking that Russell, gave us an out if we didn't want to believe in possession. I think that it's pretty heavily on the possession side. But if you really wanted to nitpick, maybe you could say, well, he does say that it could have been this. Yeah, but that just doesn't sound. When you read it in context and really think about it, it doesn't sound at all like that would be what it is. I think I'm going to be rambling incoherently at this point. I'm not entirely sure. In this story, okay, we have this this priest who does seem to struggle with alcoholism. Okay, we do see a little bit of the town that we are in. Again, very one-note characters. The only non-Catholic character ends up being like a bullying bigot and total anti-Semite, which was kind of, kind of a bummer. I think that this story is far more interesting if we look at it as a artifact, right? A historical artifact from the early 1960s, and especially of one that was written before Vatican II, before the Catholic Church had all of those reforms to try and modernize it. Here we see a Catholic Church which has a very strong hold over its members. This old bishop and this adult priest really think nothing of tying a teenage girl to a bed and keeping her there for an exorcism. They, of course, in our day and age, knowing about all the sexual abuse cases and everything, that is just a horrifying thought. But the people continuously defer to the church over and over again in this. The church has a very strong hold over the people that it is there supposedly to protect. This bishop very quickly comes to the decision that this girl needs an exorcism. And again, that's very different from The Exorcist, which is less than a decade later, after Vatican II, though, where exorcism is seen as like this kind of ancient, archaic ritual, which very few people actually really know anything about. In this, it seems like any parish could be having an exorcism at any time. So, anyway, would I recommend this? I think other people like this way more than I did, so yeah, you will probably also, if this sounds intriguing, like it more than I did. I will say that the chapter titles were terrific. Hell is Murky. There were some really nice moments in here in the writing, some nice descriptions. Sometimes we get a little bit too much of the exorcism ritual. Like, I don't need to know every single thing that these priests say over and over again. You can kind of sum it up for me and give me a little more plot. But I'm glad that I read it. I didn't dislike it, but I think I'm in the minority thinking that it was just okay. That's it. I still much prefer The Exorcist over this. So those were the two that I finished. I was reading, or I have been reading some other things as well. I'm part of a group read that is reading SPQR, History of Ancient Rome by Mary Beard, and I'm getting close to finishing. I'm hoping to read more today and tomorrow, and maybe finally completely get through it. And I am really enjoying it. The first third, I was a little bit like, okay, yeah, I don't really see what the big deal is about this. It just seemed like a bunch of political history that I've kind of come across before. But in the middle, I started really, I think, hearing Mary Beard's voice. And I've been pretty hooked on it ever since that middle section. And the other thing that I've started reading and going through has been a part of Book Trek 2021, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Invasion times Enemy. And see, I'm about 100 pages in. This looks like it's just your typical type of Star Trek novel, which they usually run around 130 pages, and sometimes with large text. This is not that. This is actually very small text, and it's over 330 pages. So it's actually it's probably around twice as long as your typical Star Trek book, Star Trek, mass market publication. Although it looks the same size, so it's taken me a little bit longer to get through it than I expected in that way. But also, been dealing with a lot of stuff lately as far as we had unfortunately a death in the family. I had another very close family member that was in the hospital for a few days with some serious issues. Every time I went to go pick this book up to read it, I would get like another notice on my phone or a phone call about what was going on. And I find that, when I'm distracted by things like that, I have a harder time reading fiction and keeping my head in the game. I usually just kind of go into nonfiction, which is why, last week especially, I was able to kind of get through a lot of SPQR. It's just so much easier for me to read nonfiction if I've got other distractions going on than fiction. But I do plan to finish this one this week, hopefully before the end of the end of the month, so I can actually have this done for Book Trek. But this will be the only Deep Space Nine book that I read, and I will say I am liking it actually quite a bit so far. I'm liking the writing, I'm liking the story. I know that Steve Donahue has been having really bad luck with finding Deep Space Nine novels that are anything even close to being decent. And this is my first DS9 novel, so I obviously have not been reading as much as him this month, and I have not had that issue. But I am liking this so far, so I hope that keeps up. So, yeah. So the two books I finished, we've got Between Two Fires and The Case Against Satan. So, yeah. Until next time, thank you, BookTube.